The identity crisis, exemplified by the debates over the woman question that we talked about in the last lecture, took a different form in the anxieties raised by an emerging phenomenon that was labeled at the time as mass society. In the next couple of lectures, we're going to examine the nature of that anxiety and of the phenomenon of mass society itself. Over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries, Western civilization had undergone a dramatic economic and social transformation, which had been considered a great accomplishment in 1914 at the outbreak of the First World War. But now, in the pessimistic post-war period, some intellectuals focused on the dark underbelly of this process of modernization. In other words, one of the big questions that takes shape in the 1920s and 30s is whether or not the modern world, created by the dual process of the industrial and liberal revolutions, was in fact the best of all possible worlds that it had been claimed to be. The West had dragged itself through this painful and traumatic transformation to something called modernity, but now the question was it worth it? They had worked so hard to create this new modern world, but now in the 1920s and 30s, some people began to ask whether it was a world they wanted to live in. The basic critique launched in the 1920s and 30s by a group of philosophers connected to the so-called Frankfurt School was that the modernization process that was so celebrated in the 19th century had produced a crisis that they called mass society. What was mass society, and why did it signal a crisis in Western civilization? In simple terms, if we want to start with a basic definition of mass society, it was one in which everyone and everything had become so standardized and uniform that it had erased individual differences between people and things and created an undifferentiated mass of people, thus mass society. So instead of the glorious individual championed by liberalism, modernization had produced a world of clones who thought alike, dressed alike, acted alike, very much like the character in a poem written by W.H. Auden in 1939 called The Unknown Citizen. And I'll just quote a stanza from the poem to give you a sense. Quote, "He had everything necessary to the modern man, a gramophone, a radio, a car, and a Frigidaire. Our researchers into public opinion are content that he held the proper opinions for the time of the year. When there was peace, he was for peace. When there was war, he went. He was married and added 5 children to the population, which our eugenist says was the right number for a parent of his generation. Was he free? Was he happy? The question is absurd. Had anything been wrong, we certainly would have heard." Unquote. The vision of uniformity expressed in this poem was for many the nightmare of the mass man, a generic unknown citizen who signaled the end of the creative era of Western liberal civilization and its decline into conformity, mediocrity, and stagnation. Or to put it another way, mass society marked for many the death of the individual, that cornerstone of liberal society. The implication was that if the individual was really dead, then so was the Enlightenment project, which of course was based on the individual. In this lecture, or in the rest of this lecture, I want to focus on where mass society came from and what were the conditions that made it possible. Well, next time we'll talk about the implications. So what were the roots of this condition that the critics at the time called mass society? One of the great ironies of mass society was that it was a product of all the triumphant achievements of modern Western civilization. And that irony is one we have to really keep in mind to understand the depth of anxiety about it. So in other words, the preconditions for mass society were created by those very cornerstones of Western civilization, industrial capitalism and liberal democracy. This meant, of course, that the very triumphs of Western civilization might now be the cause of its downfall. Just as in, if you remember, the new destructive association between technology or the new destructive association about technology in the linking of the words machine and gun. Whereas technology had been always associated with progress in the 19th century, after World War I, it was associated with something new. This is the same sort of process. These achievements of industrialization and of liberal democracy, which had been seen as kind of as unalterably positive, now were thought of in a more ambivalent way. So the dangers of mass society shocked people into realizing that the larger modernization process that had made the West great could possibly destroy it as well. The great fear, then, is not that Western civilization is being attacked from without, but that it carried the seeds of its own destruction within itself. So how specifically was mass society rooted in modern Western civilization, according to this argument? Let's begin with the process of democratization, which begins with the French Revolution and culminates with universal suffrage in the early 20th century. So it's a process that covers the long 19th century. It was, of course, the French Constitution of 1793 that first instituted universal male suffrage and proposed and proclaimed a radical democratic vision of mass participation in government and radical social equality. Of course, after the revolution was suppressed in 1815, the old aristocratic and monarchical political and social orders were reestablished across most of Europe, which meant that going back or recovering that kind of democratic equality becomes the project of the 19th century. In other words, the democratic project of the 19th century becomes the fight to remove all the artificial privileges of aristocracy, of hierarchy that was based on birth and blood, title, status, and so on. In contrast, in the democratic vision, of course, everybody would start on a level playing field. Everybody would be equal rather than fixed in the social order depending upon their birth or their title. Now, in the 19th century, the only people who thought that this vision was a dangerous one were conservative thinkers, like Alexis de Tocqueville, for example. De Tocqueville worried that pervasive egalitarianism would create what he called the worship of mediocrity and undermine individual excellence. In his travels through the recently created United States of America in the 1820s, Tocqueville saw the impact of what he called a society without fixed social roles, in which, as he said, an innumerable crowd of those striving to escape from their original social condition, unquote, marked American life. This social mobility symbolized for him the rootlessness of a democratic society and the rootlessness that was engendered by democratic opportunity. In his book, Democracy in America, which was written in the early 1830s, Tocqueville summarized his doubts about the compatibility between liberalism and democracy. In his famous phrase, the tyranny of the majority, Tocqueville defined the fear that a culture of the masses would stifle individual creativity. Thus, the democratic rule of the majority, he argued, could be just as oppressive as any other kind of tyranny. In the 19th century, these concerns remained on the conservative margin of political discourse. The first non-conservative philosopher, we might say, to take them up in the late 19th century was Nietzsche. And I think you can fit in this kind of discussion about the death of the individual to some of the ideas we talked about that come out of Nietzsche's thinking, as we talked about in an earlier lecture. But of course, Nietzsche's ideas don't really enter the mainstream until the early 20th century, once again, until after the First World War. At that point, Nietzsche's ideas about the Superman, who of course is kind of the ultra-individual in Nietzsche's thinking, that creative individual who was not allowed to flourish because of the mediocrity of a society, of an egalitarian society. So those ideas reemerge in Nietzsche. But those ideas resonate once again with a new chorus of voices in the 1920s and 1930s. So why do things change? Why do these ideas move into the mainstream in the 1920s and 30s rather than being on the conservative margin as they were in the 19th century? I think what brings the concerns about democracy to the forefront is this new era of mass politics that's just taking shape in the post-war period. With the achievement of universal male and then universal female suffrage, the political systems had to reinvent themselves to appeal, to figure out how to get the votes of this new mass of voters. For some observers, it seemed like this process, that is, this process of reinventing an elite political system to become a mass political system, that what was happening in the process was that rational political discourse was being replaced by emotional slogans, and that so-called responsible parties were being swamped by demagogic parties which simply were trying to, again, reach these innumerable voters. So demagogic parties like the fascists, for example, who were using spectacle and pageantry to get people involved rather than rational political arguments. In this new unfamiliar political world of mass political rallies, common uniforms, marches, flags, banners, salutes, and so on, it seemed like the crowd had replaced the individual as the political subject. One of the intellectuals who spoke most vehemently about the dangers of these trends in the 1920s was the Spanish philosopher Ortega y Gasset, who published a book in 1929 called The Revolt of the Masses. In it, Ortega defines the reality of modern politics, or what he sees as the reality of modern politics, precisely in terms of what he calls the crowd phenomenon. He coins the concept of the mass man who, quote, doesn't value himself, who feels instead that he is like everybody and is satisfied in being identical to others, unquote. In other words, going back to Auden's vision of the unknown citizen that I quoted you early on. In Ortega's mind, the democratizing process had created this bland mass man, identical to all other men, who were slowly taking over the rule of society from what he called the superior minorities. And for him, the superior minorities was not a traditional aristocracy of birth, but an aristocracy of talent. That is, those who truly had more talent than others. For Ortega, society should be a dynamic between what he said were the common people and those superior minorities. And that this was what he called the tempering of democracy by liberalism. Liberalism being, in a sense, the rule of those superior minorities. In the 20th century, he argued that this dynamic was unbalanced, or was becoming unbalanced, by what he called hyper-democracy. Hyper-democracy run rampant. As he put it, the majority is taking over the front rows from the superior minority, turning society into an army of captains instead of soldiers and officers. In other words, this was the fruit, he said, of the notion that all men are equal, something which is proclaimed in the 18th century, written into constitutions in the 19th century, but finally believed by the masses in the 20th century. But how could the masses really take political control? What does that mean in concrete terms? What made this threat from the so-called mass man more concrete in the 20th century, and especially in the post-war period, was, of course, the combination of universal suffrage, that is, that all of these mass men now could vote somebody in and out of office, the new literacy rates, because, of course, from the late 19th century in the Western European countries, most of the adult men can now read and write, an increasing percentage of the women as well. And the last thing is the new power of public opinion. As Ortega said, in the modern world, or as he argued, in the modern world it was no longer the rule of force or the rule of law which directed society, but, as he said, the preponderance of an opinion that formed the base of rule. What worried him was that the opinions of the masses were not tethered to the traditional cultural and intellectual norms that guided the superior minority, but they were subject to passing whims. That was his fear. On the other side of the Atlantic, the American author Walter Lippmann expressed a similar set of fears in his 1922 book, Public Opinion. He was one of the first to distinguish between, or to distinguish what this new phenomenon was of public opinion. Public opinion in capital letters, as opposed to public opinion in lower case letters. In capital letters, well, let's start with the reverse. In lowercase letters, public opinion was simply, as he said, the pictures we all form in our minds of the world outside. In very simple terms, the pictures we form about public affairs. These pictures become public opinion in capital letters when they're acted upon by groups of individuals. In other words, public opinion in capitals is a feature of a new political reality in which it is groups rather than individuals that set the tone. So public opinion in capitals is a feature of groups, whereas public opinion in lowercase is just the ideas that we have as individuals. Lippmann's book set out to analyze why the pictures that people form inside their heads of public affairs are so often misguided. That was what he was concerned about, misleading. And he examines a series of factors that limit what he calls clear perception. Things like censorship, which don't allow full access to information, the limited time that people have to dedicate to public affairs, which again limits their information. Again, other factors like the scant information provided by political slogans. You know, what we would now see as the 15 or 30-second television ad. And lastly, another factor he argued was basic stereotypes that people hold that keep us from having full information to make political decisions. What he argues is that democratic theory never took this problem seriously. That is, democratic theory simply assumed that people had all the information to make rational decisions. Remember, that goes back to the Enlightenment notion that individuals are rational actors and that they are able to make reasonable judgments about their basic interests. While this assumption might have worked, he argued, in the limited political world of the 19th century, when you're talking about the top 5 or 10% of the population, it was a fiction, he said, that each citizen in the 20th century could somehow form a rational opinion about every item of public affairs. Even if every citizen read his newspaper daily, he said, the newspapers simply reflect and augment the distortions of public opinion rather than provide a correct orientation. What he was saying, in other words, was that public opinion had overwhelmed individual thinking in politics, and that this public opinion was not a rational influence but an irrational one, formed by all of these kind of uncontrollable factors. And that this irrational force of public opinion was swaying politicians from doing the right thing. Like Ortega, then, Lippmann thought that democracy needed to be tempered by the expertise of a superior minority. And for Lippmann, that superior minority was defined as political science. So for him, the role of political scientists was to shape public opinion, was to give it the rational basis that it needed to make the right kinds of decisions. As he says, quote, "It is no longer possible to believe in the original dogma of democracy, that the knowledge needed for the management of human affairs comes up spontaneously from the human heart," unquote. Instead, it was the role of political scientists to organize public opinion. Now, if we look back at Ortega and at Lippmann, on the one hand, we could simply dismiss them as elitist thinkers. On the other hand, many of the ideas or the issues and problems they raised they still inform contemporary debate about the issue. So, for example, in the gubernatorial election in the fall of 2003 in California, which of course was an election that in a sense was caused by public opinion, right? The election itself, the recall election, was a product of changed public opinion. So the debates around that election were precisely the same kinds of terms raised by Ortega and Lippmann. That is, on the one hand, you had people arguing that this was, in a sense, the highest expression of democracy, the fact that the people could speak. Whereas on the other hand, you had people arguing that this election was the manipulation of public opinion into an irrational decision. So it's however you come down on whatever one felt about this election or whatever one feels about Lippmann and Ortega's ideas, it still informs the debate about democracy today. So however you conclude, whatever conclusions you come to about Lippmann's and Ortega's judgment, what they were right about is the new impact of public opinion in politics. There was no argument about that. So it was in the 1930s, for example, that it becomes institutionalized in the formal opinion poll. It was from the 1930s that the opinion poll, the Gallup poll, is established in 1935, which gives us the capacity to know what the public mood is at every moment. By implication, of course, polls gave the public a channel through which to influence and shape public policy. So the public opinion poll, in a sense, becomes the symbol of democratization and the influence of the masses in politics in modern society. So what other aspects of modernization form the precondition for mass society? The process of capitalist industrialization and all its offshoots is the next factor I want to talk about. On a basic level, like democracy, capitalism, of course, has a leveling impact as well, in that it reduces everything to what Marx called a cash nexus. That is, in a capitalist society, everything is valued by what it costs on in the marketplace. So it reduces a complicated value system on everything from food to culture to a materialist measurement. Ortega argued, for example, that this materialism produced a contempt for the traditional values of civilization and created a self-satisfied society that worshipped material comforts as an end in themselves. But more specifically, industrialization reduced the distinction between products by standardizing them, making them uniform, mass-producing them. The phenomenon of 20 billion McDonald's hamburgers exactly the same. Instead of the unique handmade item, we have hundreds of exactly the same item pouring off the assembly line. Moreover, of course, in this assembly production, no individual ever makes a whole object, but only makes part of an object, simply contributes his small part. And there's that wonderful scene in Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times where he is moving his wrench to make, as part of his assembly line job, 1,000 times a day, he's doing the same single movement. As Ortega put it poetically, this modern man has lost contact with an integral interpretation of the universe. A nice poetic way of putting it. So instead of a society of shoemakers, candle makers, etc., we have people who perform discrete, meaningless tasks that could go into making a shoe or a candle or something else. I think you can see how this process helps erase distinctions and increase uniformity. Finally, capitalist industrialization contributed to the creation of mass society with the technology that brought people out of their narrow worlds and linked them with each other. That's an important point. The opinion poll, of course, is part of this technology because it links people with each other. It forms public opinion in capital letters. But there are other technologies like television, radio, records, and so on. What these links provided was the possibility for everyone to receive the same message and to experience, even instantaneously, the same culture. And that's going to be an important point. I'll develop that, especially next time. The key to reaching everyone with the same message, of course, was the mass media. Now, newspapers had existed for a long time. They were not a new invention. But with the new literacy rates in the early 20th century, more people are reading the newspapers. So by the 1920s, most adults are reading and can read them. In addition, new forms of printed media meant for mass consumption appear. So, for example, in the U.S., you get the creation of Reader's Digest in 1922, which was the first form, we might say, of infotainment for the masses. Life magazine, which is with its glossy pictures in the 1930s. The Book of the Month Club was created in 1926, which again encouraged the reading public to read the same books. Along with these new printed forms come a new format, what we might call the tabloid format of large print and sensational headlines that were again designed for a mass audience. At the same time, and this is also an important point, especially in the United States, the number of newspapers are shrinking. That is, they're being consolidated. Local newspapers are shutting down, and they're becoming branches of big media conglomerates like, of course, the Hearst Corporation. So by the 1930s, for example, 1 of every 4 Sunday newspapers in the U.S. is owned by the Hearst Corporation. So what that kind of consolidation means is that it creates the possibility for the first time of a national culture. That if everybody is reading the same kind of news, then there's a possibility for a kind of shared public opinion. Perhaps the most literate nation in this sense was the British, where halfpenny newspapers like the Daily Mail helped sell enough newspapers so that by 1920, half of the adult population read the daily paper. Electronic media like the telephone, the telegraph, radio, TV enhanced this potential mass audience because they didn't require literacy, of course, and because they offered the possibility of millions experiencing the same thing simultaneously. Radio in the 1920s was an important step in this direction. While the first broadcasts in the early 1920s were one-time transmissions, after 1921 and 22, permanent broadcasting facilities were established in the US, Europe, and Japan, and radios began to be mass-produced. By the end of the 1930s, 90% of American homes and three of every four British households owned a radio. The potential for shared cultural experiences increased after national radio networks get established. Once again, so the same programs are being shown across the country. The BBC is established in 1926, and CBS and NBC in the United States are established after 1927. One of the first notable examples of this ability of every person to listen to the same program at the same time were the fireside chats that Roosevelt held in the 1930s on Sunday evenings. The notion, of course, was that it was like the president coming into every home, sitting by his, your fireplace, and everyone could listen at the same time. The difference between that kind of simultaneous mass experience and reading about his speech in a newspaper several days later is quite different. With the invention of television, this capacity is even more enhanced. That is, you're able to share that full common visual experience. So we have the picture of every family in America sitting down on Sunday evening to watch the Ed Sullivan Show in the 1950s. No matter where you lived, what class you belonged to, you shared being entertained by Ed Sullivan. Furthermore, of course, Ed Sullivan was a variety show which showcased new acts, new entertainment. Elvis Presley, of course, made his first big splash. The British rock and roll groups, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, made their first entrance into America through the Ed Sullivan Show. Why is this significant? The point is that this is all part of the creation of a new mass culture which everyone is sharing. And we're being introduced to those new products of mass culture through Ed Sullivan, who is our nation's host. In other words, this new technology of mass media is creating a phenomenon of mass culture, which is what we'll talk about next time, something that can be experienced by the entire nation. The last factor that contributes to this broader linkage is urbanization and the geographic mobility that accompanied industrialization. With people moving to new cities with greater geographic mobility, of course what happens is that old local communities are dying out. And people are participating in a more generic urban culture that's the same in New York or Los Angeles or Chicago, and then later on, of course, even in Paris or Tokyo. When people are cut off from their traditional culture, they also lose their sense of moral connectedness to this culture or their moral groundedness. They become rootless, in a sense. All of this, again, contributes to the greater homogeneity of society, that people lose their roots in specific local cultures. So if we sum up the effects of all these preconditions, from democratization to industrialization and urbanization, they all contribute in one way or another to this process of erasing the distinctions between individuals that prepares them to become part of the undifferentiated mass. If you look at it schematically, democracy, in a sense, created the audience for mass society. Industrialization created the tools and the products, and capitalism created the organization and the profit motive. So mass society required the combination of the ideology of egalitarianism and the technological capacity to reach everyone with the same message. In the next lecture, then, we'll talk about the implications of such a society and why the critics thought it was such a dangerous innovation.